The Living World, Chapter 1, Segment 1, Characteristics of Living Organisms. Before we start with our chapter, let us first acquaint ourselves with some basic terms related to biology. First comes morphology. Morphology is defined as the study of external, visible characters. Anatomy, on the other hand, is defined as the study of internal characters. For instance, let us take a plant. In a plant, the study of the venation of a leaf, the floral appendages of a flower, the types of fruit, constitute the study of morphology. But the study of the xylem and phloem constitute a part of anatomy. The flower, fruit and leaf can be seen externally, but the xylem and the phloem of the stem are internal structures and hence will be studied under anatomy. On the other hand, physiology refers to the study of life processes or metabolism. A life process is a process which is integral and crucial to support life. Example, digestion, respiration, excretion, circulation, etc. Metabolism refers to the sum total of all the life processes occurring in the body of living organisms. So metabolism can be defined as a cumulative term. So physiology makes an attempt to study metabolism, which is the driving force in the body of living organisms. Next, we must familiarize ourselves with the terms intra and inter. Intra means within. Inter means between or among. When I use the word intracellular process, it means a process occurring inside one cell. Whereas, if I use the term intercellular transport, it means transport of materials between or among cells. Likewise, we have two other terms, in vivo and in vitro. In vivo means in a living cell. In vitro, on the other hand, means in an artificial aseptic, that is sterilized medium outside a living cell with conditions akin to a living cell. In vivo fertilization means fertilization occurring inside the body. On the other hand, in vitro fertilization, commonly known as test tube babies, is fertilization of the female gamete by the sperm occurring in an external artificial medium, that is in the laboratory, in a petri dish, which is provided with the same conditions as those which are present inside the living body. The only difference is that in vivo fertilization occurs inside the body, whereas in vitro occurs in the laboratory in an artificial medium. But the conditions are the same because otherwise the process of fertilization cannot occur. Characteristics of living organisms. Now that we have acquainted ourselves with basic terms, we will delve deeper into the chapter. First comes the definition of life. Life can be defined as an unique, essential aggregation of molecules with metabolism leading to growth, reproduction, and adaptation. So life is defined as an aggregation or accumulation of molecules. Biological organization begins at the submicroscopic or molecular level. A living organism must exhibit metabolism And as a result of metabolism, growth, reproduction, adaptation, and other consequences are bound to occur. So this is a wholesome definition of life. Next comes the characteristics of living organisms. Living organisms have many characteristics, but the characteristics which are most common are only 5. They are cellular organization, that is, a living organism must be made of cells, because a cell is the basic structural and functional unit of life. We can highlight one exception over here. The exception is of the virus. Viruses are not made of any cells, and hence we don't consider them as purely living. Rather, they are considered as intermediates between living and non-living. The next character is metabolism, which we have already discussed. It is the sum total of all the processes occurring in the body of living organisms. The third character is growth. Growth basically implies an increase in size, an increase in number. The fourth character is reproduction. That is the production of offsprings by grown-up individuals of the same kind. And reproduction is obviously necessary for the perpetuation or continuity of a species. The last and the most complicated character is consciousness or sensitivity. Consciousness is the ability of an organism to respond to changes in the environment. So, in this segment, we have summarized 5 characters of living organisms, which will be elaborated further. Cellular organization. All living organisms have cellular organization. As discussed earlier, a cell is the basic structural and functional unit of life. We have a system of classification termed the 5-kingdom system of classification. Let us learn the 5-kingdom system of classification with respect to the levels of organization. The first kingdom is kingdom Monera, which includes bacteria. These are unicellular, prokaryotic, having cellular level of organization. Unicellular means that they are made of only one cell. Prokaryotic means that in their cells, the nucleus is not bound by a nuclear membrane. In other words, the genetic material lies scattered in the cytoplasm of the cell. The next kingdom is Protista. Protista, like Monera, is unicellular, made of only one cell, and it is eukaryotic, meaning that it possesses a genetic material which is limited by a nuclear envelope. In other words, they possess a well-defined nucleus bound by a nuclear membrane. Both Monera and Protista, being made of only one cell, have a cellular level of organization because the cells, being only one in number, cannot aggregate to form a tissue. The next kingdom is kingdom Fungi. Fungi includes multicellular, eukaryotic organisms. They are multicellular, meaning that they are made of more than one cell. Eukaryotic, as discussed earlier, means that they possess a well-defined nucleus. The members of kingdom fungi have a saprobic mode of nutrition, which means that they act as saprophytes, deriving nutrition from the dead and decaying organic matter. They possess a loose tissue level of organization. That means the cells are loosely aggregated here to form tissues. The fourth kingdom is kingdom Plantae, which includes multicellular eukaryotic autotrophs, that is the plants. Plants are multicellular and eukaryotic. They possess chlorophyll, and hence they can harness the solar energy to synthesize food. Since they can synthesize their own food, they are termed autotrophs. An autotroph is basically one who can synthesize his own food and does not depend on others for food. Plants have an organ level of organization. That is, the tissues aggregate to form distinct organs. The final kingdom, which is most advanced, is kingdom Animalia. It includes the animals, which are multicellular, eukaryotic, but heterotrophic or holozoic. Heterotrophic means that animals cannot make their own food. Rather, they depend on plants for their food. It is also termed holozoic because animals ingest solid form of food. Animals have an organ system level of organization in which the organs distinctly coordinate to form an organ system. Now, cellular organization is a unique, essential, and defining property of living organisms. All the properties mentioned in the previous slide are unique and essential for living organisms, but some of them are defining properties, and we must keep a note of defining properties. Cellular organization is a defining property of living organisms because non-living things are not made of cells. We must also note that properties of tissues are not present in individual constituent cells of the tissue, but they arise as a result of interaction between the cells. We can extend this analogy to the cell and its organelles. We can also say that properties of cells are not present in the individual organelles, but the properties of the cell arise as a result of interaction between the organelles. Growth is the permanent, irreversible increase due to increase in the twin characters of increase in cell number and increase in size or mass. So growth has two defining features. First, the increase in the number of cells, and second, the increase in the mass or size. For instance, we can measure the growth of a microbial culture by counting the number of cells. If the number increases from 800 to 1000, we can say that growth has occurred. Whereas, we can measure the increase of a plant or a human by the increase in its size or increase in its mass. Growth is unique, essential, but unlike cellular organization, it is not a defining property of living organisms because certain non-living objects like a snow mountain or a sand dune in the desert also exhibit some form of growth. Hence, we cannot say that growth is a defining feature because non-living objects also exhibit growth. Now we'll start with the types of growth. extrinsic growth and intrinsic growth. Extrinsic growth is a characteristic of non-living objects. It occurs due to deposition of material from an external source. But we can remove the material, and hence extrinsic growth is temporary or reversible. For example, growth of a sand dune, mounds and boulders in the desert, or the growth of a snow mountain. The growth of a sugar crystal in a saturated sugar solution are examples of extrinsic growth. On the other hand, intrinsic growth occurs from inside by the process of synthesis of protoplasm in the cells. Hence, intrinsic growth is a characteristic of living organisms. So, intrinsic growth is the real form of growth. It is irreversible and permanent. We stated earlier that growth is not a defining property of living organisms, but intrinsic growth is the defining property of living organisms. Next, we will differentiate between growth in plants and growth in animals. Growth in plants is indeterminate, indefinite, and continues throughout the lifespan of the plant. So it's a continuous process. We say that growth in plants is localized due to the presence of specific tissues called meristematic tissues in specific locations of the plant. We must note that meristematic tissues are responsible for the growth of a plant. Growth of a plant can be an increase in the length of the plant, that is primary growth. It can also be an increase in its diameter or girth, which is termed secondary growth or longitudinal growth. On the other hand, growth in animals is determinate because it occurs only up to a certain age of the animal. Thereafter, growth stops. We know that cell division results in growth. So does it mean that cell division in an animal stops when its growth stops? No. Cell division continues in the animal, but it does not occur for growth, but it occurs for healing, for replacing the dead and damaged cells of the animal. Next, we will differentiate between growth in unicellular organisms and growth in multicellular organisms. Unicellular organisms are present in the kingdoms Monera and Protista. On the other hand, multicellular organisms are present in kingdoms Fungi, Plantae, and Animalia, with certain exceptions. For example, yeast, Saccharomyces, is an example of an unicellular fungus. In case of unicellular organisms, growth and reproduction are synonymous. That is, they are the same, and hence we say these are mutually inclusive events. Why do we call it synonymous? Because in a unicellular organism, growth of the cell will ultimately result in splitting of the cell into two identical daughter cells, which is by a process called binary fission. Hence, growth and reproduction are mutually inclusive. On the other hand, in multicellular organisms, growth and reproduction are mutually exclusive events because they are distinct from each other and one is not related to the other. The next feature is metabolism. Metabolism, as we have discussed earlier, is the sum total of all the processes occurring in the body of living organisms. Metabolism can be divided into two categories: catabolism and anabolism. Catabolism involves the breakdown of complex organic molecules into relatively simple inorganic components. In other words, we can say that catabolism is a biodestructive activity occurring in the cells of living organisms. Anabolism, on the other hand, involves the synthesis of complex organic molecules from simple inorganic components. So, anabolism is a biosynthetic activity. Catabolism releases energy and hence is an exergonic process. Anabolism requires intake of energy and hence is an endergonic process. Let us take the examples of catabolism and anabolism. Respiration can grossly be called a catabolic process. Actually, respiration is an amphibolic process involving both catabolism and anabolism. But for the sake of simplicity at this level, we will consider respiration as a catabolic process. Photosynthesis is an example of an anabolic process. Let us now have a look at some other examples of catabolism and anabolism. Catabolism includes digestion, respiration, excretion. Anabolism includes photosynthesis in plants, assimilation of amino acids, simple sugars, fatty acids into the protoplasm of both plants and animals, conversion of nitrates absorbed from the soil by plants into the protoplasm of the plant cells. When the rate of anabolism is greater than catabolism, the rate of synthetic activity is more than the rate of destructive activity. Consequently, growth occurs. But when rate of catabolism is greater than rate of anabolism, the destructive activities are more than the constructive activities. As a result, degrowth, that is atrophy, occurs. It is to be noted that in vitro reactions, that is, reactions occurring in an artificial aseptic medium in a cell-free system, are surely living reactions, but they are not occurring in a living organism. Technically, in vitro reactions occurring in cell-free systems are neither living nor non-living. Metabolism is thus unique, essential, and a defining property of living organisms, as non-living things do not exhibit any form of metabolism. Reproduction. Reproduction, as we have studied earlier, is the process of production of offsprings by grown-up individuals of the same kind. Reproduction is essential for perpetuation of species. However, reproduction is unique, essential, but not a defining property of living organisms, as mule, warbler, worker honeybees and infertile human couples fail to reproduce. Now, we will differentiate between two types of reproduction: asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, only one parent is involved, that is, it is uniparental. Whereas in sexual reproduction, it is generally biparental, involving the male and female parents, but it can be uniparental in case of a bisexual individual, for instance, a bisexual flower like hibiscus. Asexual reproduction may or may not involve the formation of gametes, that is, gametogenesis. But syngamy, gametic fusion, is totally absent. Whereas sexual reproduction must involve both gametogenesis and syngamy. It is important to note that gametogenesis refers to the process of formation of gametes, the sperm and the ovum, whereas syngamy refers to the fusion or union of the gametes during fertilization. Asexual reproduction generally involves mitotic or homotypic or equational division, whereas sexual reproduction involves meiotic or reduction or heterotypic division. Asexual reproduction produces morphologically, genetically similar offsprings called clones. Each individual of a clone is called ramete. Sexual reproduction produces variations on account of a phenomenon called crossing over, which occurs during meiosis. The variations provide a basis for evolution or better adaptation to a changing environment. The types of asexual reproduction are binary fission, sporulation, budding, regeneration, and fragmentation. Binary fission. Binary fission involves the division of a parent cell into two equal identical daughter cells. So one parent cell will undergo division and it will split into two cells which are termed daughter cells. Any process of cell division involves first the division of the nucleus, which is termed karyokinesis, followed by a division of the cytoplasm of the cell, termed cytokinesis. It is observed that binary fission involves equal karyokinesis and equal cytokinesis, which means that the nucleus and the cytoplasm are equally divided and distributed in the daughter cells. Binary fission occurs in amoeba, bacteria. The diagram shows a dividing bacterial cell. Sporulation, the formation of asexual spores by mitosis, is called sporulation. The spores thus formed are called mitospores. The spores will germinate to form an individual. Example, zoospore, conidia, sporangiospores. It is common in the fungi. Budding. Budding involves the formation of a protuberance or bud on the surface of a parent cell. This bud will later on get detached from the parent cell and will then grow into an individual. Budding involves equal karyokinesis but unequal cytokinesis. It is common in yeast Saccharomyces and is very common in Hydra. Regeneration, the ability to form tissues, organs, or the entire organism by virtue of a property called totipotency, is called regeneration. Totipotency is basically this property to regenerate. There are two types of regeneration, epimorphosis and morphallaxis. Epimorphosis involves regeneration of a part of the organism. That means one part of the organism has been lost and the remainder of the body regenerates that part. It is commonly observed in the regeneration of tails in lizards, limb regeneration in amphibians like frogs. Morphallaxis involves regeneration of the whole body from a part. In this case, a very small part of the body of the organism remains, and that part will develop into the entire organism. This is common in Hydra. We should note that planaria, a flatworm belonging to phylum Platyhelminthes, exhibits true regeneration. In fragmentation, the parent body breaks into thread-like filaments or strands, maybe due to mechanical injury or due to death and decay. Each fragment will then develop into an individual. It occurs in filamentous algae like Spirogyra, fungal mycelium, and the protonema stage in the life cycle of consciousness. Consciousness is the ability of the organism to detect changes in the environment and to respond to the changes. These changes are called stimuli. A stimuli can be external or internal. Consciousness is unique, essential, and a defining property of living organisms. We must note that man is the only organism with self-consciousness. That is, he is not only aware of his surroundings, but is also aware of himself. All organisms from prokaryotes to eukaryotes respond to stimuli. It is in fact the most complicated feature of living organisms. External stimuli include light and heat, while internal stimuli can be hunger and thirst. Some plants, for instance, require low temperature to flower. This process of subjecting plants to low temperature to induce flowering is called vernalization. Some plants need appropriate photoperiod, length of day, for flowering. Diurnal animals, which are active during the daytime, are yet another example of the response of animals to light. The photoperiod, implying the length of day, also influences breeding in animals and plants. Such organisms are called seasonal breeders. Examples among the plants include radish, soybean, and among animals include goat, sheep, and horse. An important point to note is of the patients in coma. They are virtually supported by machines to replace the heart and the lungs. They are otherwise brain dead. These patients lack self-consciousness. We will discuss the remaining part of the chapter in the next segment. If you like my video and want to hit NEET in a click, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you.